So I'm going to ask, this is the face of God for me this morning, and I'd ask you if you recognize this person, and I would guess you wouldn't, other than you can see his name at the top of it. Does anybody know who this is? Well, good. It'll be a surprise for you. You do? I knew you would, Barb. So I'll introduce him a little bit later in why he represents for the face of God for me this week. But I thought I'd start by recounting I've been struck this past week, it's been happening this past week, who has been following, the gentleman's name's Carson King. Who's been following that story? 24-year-old young man, he goes to Sports Center game day and holds up a sign that says his Bud Light needs to be replenished, and he has a Venmo. Now, I'm old enough to know to ask my daughter what Venmo is, but it's some way to collect money. And just kind of an innocent, kind of fun little joke, but it actually really picked up a lot of steam. And actually, he raised over $1 million at one point, and then decided, of course, that was more Bud Light than he could ever drink, so instead he was going to give it to the Children's Hospital at the University of Iowa. It was a feel-good story, a fun kind of feel-good story. But then it kind of took a turn. A reporter from the Des Moines Register did a little background reporting on it, discovered he had posted some tweets that could only be described as racist when he was about 16 years old, and had called Carson about those to get his feedback on what they represented. And Carson, to his credit, the very next day called a press conference and told the reporters and said to them, I posted these horrible things when I was a kid, and I've grown since then, and I duly and fully apologize for what I said when I was 16 and what I put out there on Twitter. And I fully apologize, and I want to come clean and let you know that that's not how I think these days. Well, Bud Light, which had made a $300,000 contribution, did continue the contribution, but kind of dropped Carson. And the reporter who found out this information actually got fired from the Des Moines Register, let go. And what had been a feel-good story became now a kind of focused, angry discussion online, condemnation and judgment of him or how he was treated, and what had been this beautiful story, which I think actually the money raised is close to $2 million for the Children's Hospital. It's been turned into something about forgiveness or can we forget certain things. It's turned into something rather ugly in some ways, which is unfortunate. But the reality, and what struck me about that story is, that's our world today, isn't it? Condemnation and judgment in 280 characters or less on Twitter, right? People post responses or on Facebook, these screeds in some ways, this kind of sense of judgment and condemnation of others. We live in a political world these days in which people righteously condemn those they disagree with. It's kind of a mean kind of world in which it's kind of a politics of cruelty, where truth doesn't matter so much as name-calling and denigrating another human being. It's a hard world out there these days, especially in the social media and on the internet. It's a very hard world to even begin to reflect on what does forgiveness mean in today's world. And so the story of Joseph, while we may remember it from our Sunday school days, it's a meaningful story about forgiveness, but let's be honest, it feels a little quaint these days, doesn't it? Feels a little odd story to try to remember, because no one in today's world would really pay attention to what that story has to say about who we're supposed to be as human beings, as children of God. And we need to remember that story. Hannah did a great job summarizing. Here's Joseph. He's probably the ultimate victim in the world today. He was victimized by his brothers. Now, we tend to try to explain away people's victimhood by simply saying, well, he was kind of arrogant, he kind of deserved it a little bit. We do that with victims these days, because God forbid they be vulnerable, He kind of deserved it. He was arrogant. He told his brothers, he had a dream in which he was bigger than they were, and they were going to bow to him. And he was the favorite of his father, Jacob, right? And the story goes that his brothers, he'd gotten this beautiful robe, multicolored robe, and showed it off to his brothers, and his brothers reacted rather negatively. You could say that. They hit him over the head and threw him in a hole in the ground. And then there's this passing caravan, and so what they do is they sell Joseph to this passing caravan, who will take him to Egypt, and he will be sold. He is a slave. He's been enslaved. And then they lie to his beloved father and say he'd been killed by a wild animal. They'd even gotten some lamb's blood and put it on the coat, the multicolored coat. And we may not remember, but the story unfolds that Joseph ends up a slave to a particular household and experiences certain abuse and false accusations, and then ends up in prison. He's not only enslaved, he's imprisoned. Innocent, but powerless, a victim, it seems. Ultimately abandoned, it would seem, by God, by his brothers. And then through this odd, kind of interesting story in which he interprets dreams, he comes to the attention of the Pharaoh. It's a really fun little story as it unfolds, but ultimately he ends up in a position from the lowest of the low in prison to be lifted up to be an official, a respected official in Egypt, beloved by Pharaoh and his household. And then, surprise, surprise, Jacob has sent all the brothers to Egypt because the land is in a great famine. They don't have enough to feed themselves. He sends them to speak to the Pharaoh to see if they could get enough food to survive this long, extended famine. And Joseph sees his brothers. He observes them in secret. And here's the people who had cast him down, enslaved him. These are the people who had done these horrible things to him and victimized him, and yet he sees them. And the line is, he makes himself known to them. And in an odd kind of way, he forgives them. It's kind of hard to imagine, hard to encapsulate. But actually, it's far more radical than that. It isn't simply that he forgave them. He did something even more powerful, harder to imagine. He made himself known to them. In other words, in the Hebrew, it kind of conveys a sense of letting them, others know who he was. To make himself, in a way, a word we might use, is he made himself vulnerable to them. He didn't just simply forgive them, he opened himself fully to them. And in a rather wrenching scene, begins to weep so loudly people could hear it. He opens himself to them and shares his pain and his struggle, shares how much he's been hurt. So it isn't simply that he's inviting them to come and that he will take care of them with all their household, with all their goods, that he will protect them. It isn't simply that he forgave them. What was even more radical than that was he was willing to be vulnerable to the very people who had harmed him. Think about that. Just think about the kind of courage it takes to not only forgive and set something aside, but a willingness to make himself vulnerable to the very people who harmed him so profoundly. That's radical. And the truth is that Jesus, over and over in his life, talked about what it means to be a child of God, what it means to be with other human beings, is you are supposed to be that radically vulnerable to each other. Over and over, he preaches that it isn't simply enough to forgive someone. It isn't simply enough that you can feel empowered, that I'm able to pass on my forgiveness to you for some harm you've done to me. And in fact, it's far deeper and more radical than that you're called to make yourself vulnerable to God, to your neighbor, and to a stranger. Now, I don't know about you, but I find that unsettling when I hear words like, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who find themselves at the end of their rope, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are those who make themselves vulnerable to the world. Now, how many of you have heard of Brene Brown? She's a social worker, academician who's written, in fact, she's on, if you ever want a really engaging TED Talk, Google her. It's one of the most seen TED Talks. And Brene Brown talks about something that we might find unsettling, and she calls it the power of vulnerability. That we live in a culture and society in which our vulnerability is discouraged to each other. You know that? That in many ways it's almost impossible and very frightening for us to be willing to be vulnerable to our friends, much less anybody else. And she argues that unless you are vulnerable, you cannot really be compassionate. Unless you're vulnerable, you cannot really be a forgiving human being. And there's a quote she has. She says, vulnerability is the birthplace of love, of belonging, of joy, of courage, of empathy, and of creativity. Vulnerability is the source of hope, empathy, accountability, and authenticity. If we want greater clarity in our purpose or deeper and more meaningful spiritual lives, it's not simply enough to be forgiving to others. You have to be, even more than that, vulnerable to others. And let's admit it, that's hard these days. It's hard for us to be vulnerable in church, right? To share our pain, our struggle. It's hard for us to admit our weaknesses and our uncertainties, our doubts, the places where we're broken. Now, that gentleman, his name is Brian Stevenson, and he is a lawyer. I know it's hard to believe that you can see the face of God in a lawyer, but he's a lawyer, trained at Harvard, grew up in I believe, in the South. I believe it's where he grew up. And he works for the Southern Poverty Law Center, and he particularly felt called, because of his life experience, to work with the poorest of the poor, those who were on death row, who could not afford a lawyer. So he began to work in the Deep South, in these deep prisons where he went, and he defended people on death row. And he has a line, he says, each of us, he says, is more than the worst thing we've ever done. Each of us is always more than the worst thing that we've ever done. And he believed that about these people he served on the death row, so he became connected to them. And there's another quote he has in a book he wrote, which is called Just Mercy, which I believe is going to be made into a movie here. If it not already has, will be soon made into a movie that tells about his life working with these people on death row, where he says, and he argues this powerfully, there is a strength, a power even in understanding brokenness, because embracing our brokenness creates a need and desire for mercy. Perhaps a corresponding need to show mercy. When you experience mercy, you learn things that are hard to learn otherwise. You see things you can't see otherwise. You hear things you can't otherwise hear. You begin to recognize the humanity that resides in each of us. So I'd like to send you forward today and encourage you to show mercy, but I'm actually wanting to ask us as we go forth today to do something far more meaningful than even showing forgiveness. I want you to have the courage to be vulnerable and show your brokenness to another human being. Now, there's one more picture. This is an odd one, a face of God, but I love this. In fact, I was reminded of this. The Presbyterian Disaster Agency had a little resiliency workshop here at our church. There was about a dozen of us here. And they shared this, and I'd forgotten about this till they shared this. Who here has heard of, and I'm not sure I'm going to say this right, kintsugi? It's well, you would, of course, Greg. The kintsugi is this centuries-old practice of taking broken ceramic pots that have been broken in the day-to-day life, and instead of kind of trying to cover up the cracks, right? Instead of trying to use an invisible glaze, they in fact take gold-dusted adhesive to highlight the cracks that are in the ceramic bowl. And I love that. Because the truth is, the best thing we have to offer to people is our brokenness. That the gold of God's grace is most especially present in the cracks of our lives. And as scary as it sounds, as much courage as it takes, I think healing and forgiveness will only come when we, like Joseph, are willing to show our brokenness. To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.